Thank you very much for coming out tonight, especially for this interesting topic. You probably had never really heard the term morticulture before. Excellent. I hadn't either until this year. My name is Margery Winters. I am the president of the Simsbury Land Trust. I'm also on the Simsbury Conservation Commission and the Open Space Commission. And coming before the town is always, we have a lot of forest on not only on the land trust property, but also in town property, and how to maintain and manage those woodlands is a big issue that we're trying to explore. And to that end, I've been taking a course called the Master Woodland. Oops, I'm going. Excuse me. Just a quick review. I've been taking that course to learn more. There's so much to learn about how forests work. But I also am an instructor at Roaring Brook Nature Center. I've been there since '96. And when I was a little girl, I used to go into the woods. I grew up in Vancouver, British Columbia, and we had woods behind our house. And one of the things that always fascinated me were the lovely old trees that had fallen down and rotted. And I remember going with my father. I wanted to start a little garden. I remember going into the woods with my father, and we got some old rotting wood. And we brought that back and incorporated it into the garden. I thought that was the best thing. So I've always been fascinated by the trees after they've completed, at the end of their life cycle. So I came across a study by a professor out in the West Coast, up in Oregon, and he actually had been knocking down trees and watching how they rotted and looking at their ecological value, what the process was for their rotting, and what did they bring? What was their usefulness? So that got me thinking about this presentation. So you're all here for the very first of the morticulture presentations I've ever done. So, usually when we look at our forests, we go outside and we look at them, and they all look lovely. This forest happens to be different age stands, and there's some old ones and some young ones, and there's an understory. That's very important for a nice, healthy forest. It's sort of a mixed age. And we look at the trees. And when we look at trees, we know that they provide a variety of things. If you ask the children what trees do, they'll always say, give oxygen. They also filter the air. They will cool. If you have a tree near your house, it will cool your house. The roots hold on to the soil. Of course, there's food for wildlife, places for the wildlife to live. And we just love trees. Now, if you're looking at it from an economic point of view, there's also an incredible value to trees. And this is where, we do need trees. We have plenty of wood things in here, in this room, but there's a wide variety of things that we use trees for. So they're a very incredibly important resource. And we have to, factor that into our appreciation of trees. But the dead ones, are they any good? When we go through the woods, we will see dead trees. And actually, that's part of the process in a forest. Sometimes it's, those are trees that are not going to be necessarily harvested for lumber. They're not going to have an economic value. But do they have any other value? What if there's just one? Well, that's probably not a problem. What if there are quite a few? Now people start to say, well, we're missing out on that economic resource that we all appreciate. But is this a problem? Or is this part of the process that forests go through? And which one has more value? Now, from an economics value, we already know, a dead tree is not all that valuable. But there are other ways of considering the value to a tree. Which has more value to a forest? That's really a different question altogether than whether it has value to us personally or economically. So which tree has more value to a forest? So when I started thinking about this, I thought, all right, I'm going to get a life cycle picture of the tree. And there we are, the life cycle of an oak tree. You have the acorn, and of course, if it gets planted by the little squirrels, it'll turn into a sprout. And then it will grow into a young tree, and then a mature oak tree. And there you go, the oak trees make acorns. But there's a fundamental flaw in this particular diagram. It doesn't include what's missing right there. There's an incredibly valuable thing. And when we don't see it, when we're not presented with this, and this is the case with most life cycles. I know that I've presented to children in nature courses, it just goes from adult to child, and there's nothing in between. Most of us would be considered redundant from a nature point of view, but there's still value to us, and there's still value to the tree. So when a tree reaches a mature state, it is incredibly important in the woodlands. It can actually retain an awful lot of carbon. It will produce an awful lot of acorns. It's really at its a peak value in the woods. However, there's also value in when it's starting to decline. As it starts to decline, there are a lot of opportunities for wildlife in this tree. And then when it really is declining, whether it's just as a dead tree, a snag, or when it collapses completely and becomes a hollow log or a rotting log, there is incredible value to it then. And then, of course, as it decomposes, it's also valuable because it's returning this wonderful, rich, dark brown stuff to the soil, this humus. And that is incredibly important for the soil, which is going to then nurture the next little acorn. So the life cycle, if we really want to be, complete of it, it should include the old stages of the tree as well as the young. But in most of our life cycles that we are taught as children, they don't include those stages. So we're missing out on that in the way we think about these things. So when we look at a forest, and this is the case with a lot of our forests in Connecticut, we're looking at things that might be missing here. If you look at that forest, you can see that there are some things that are missing. We have the bigger trees, we have the little trees. There's nothing on the ground, and that is of concern to me. We want to, and also, if you want to really look at it, this lovely old tree, this wonderfully old tree, from a forestry point of view, is called overmature. We are all overmature. But this is probably one of the most important trees in the forest, from a whole lot of reasons. And I love the fact we have old wolf trees. Have you ever heard the term wolf tree? It's not because wolves have anything to do with it. It's like a lone wolf. It stands by itself in a field, and that's because of the past history in Connecticut. In Connecticut in 1830, we hardly had any forest, and that's because people were chopping down the forest so they could have pasture land, and especially pasture land to raise sheep. There was a merino wool craze, and you didn't need trees to raise sheep. So, but every once in a while, a wolf tree, a tree would be left, or a pasture tree would be left in the middle of the field to provide shade for the horses and cows on a hot summer's day. Well, when Connecticut farms were abandoned in around the 1880s, a lot of these fields would start to grow back into trees. You know how it is, if you don't mow your lawn, suddenly you have trees growing in your backyard. Connecticut grows trees extraordinarily well. We've just got the right climate for growing trees. But another problem is we tend to look at trees from the ground up. That's the part that we are aware of. But I would like to encourage you, next time you go for a walk, to look down. What is on the forest soil? How much of woody debris is on the forest soil? Now, I know my father did not like this. He came from the Versailles School of Landscape Design, that everything had to be very, very neat and tidy, and he would go into our little woods and tidy up all those unsightly things down on the ground. We are a very tidy people. Nature is not tidy. But we need those old dead snags. Well, how do we get the dead trees? How do we get the dead snags? How do we get the logs? Well, how the tree dies will really affect the value of that tree in the forest. If trees die in different ways, they leave a different kind of wildlife habitat. So we know that we have ice storms. We were very lucky. We just dodged an ice storm a couple of weeks ago. That was good. But really large ice storms will leave a lot of damage, a lot of broken limbs, and that allows rot to get into the tree. Windstorms. This is a microburst in the Adirondacks. You can see not all the trees were down. Some trees were broken off the tops, and you can see that they're sort of standing snags, and then some very tall ones. And this is what the area might look like after a large windstorm. We have a big, hurricane in Connecticut. A lot of our areas will look like this. We did have a really large hurricane that came through in 1938. It was called the Great Hurricane of Great New England Hurricane. It came up through the Connecticut River Valley. And there's a little statistic there. It says 2 billion trees knocked down. It was incredible. Salvage operations went on for quite some time. But you can see it was a hefty storm, 121 winds and miles per hour winds and 186. This was a major storm. Imagine what would happen if we had one of those major storms come through now. We would have a change in the forest. All of these processes, the ice storms, the wind storms, the microbursts, and you can see we are not immune to hurricanes. This is something that will reset the forest. Forests are constant. Forests are not static things. They go through various stages, and this is one of the processes that resets the forest stage, takes it back to its early stages and gets a lot of young trees. This is what it looked like after the 1938 hurricane. And all that material is called coarse woody debris. Oh, well, I'm sorry, it's now called coarse woody material because debris made it sound like it wasn't useful. So it's coarse woody material. And that is incredibly important on the forest floor. So even though this looks like a complete and utter disaster, there's life there. So we'll talk about that. Unfortunately, as I said, after the 1938 hurricane, there was a lot of salvage operations. That was a lot of valuable wood on the ground, and it was harvested. We'll talk about that. So you can see there were some trees still standing in the background. So not everything was wiped out, and those trees would then go on to become the older trees in the forest, and with a younger cohort growing up underneath it. But here's another thing that will reset the forest: the gypsy moth defoliation. And the gypsy moths are really a problem when we've had a dry year. If we have a wet year, the fungus that affects the gypsy moths kills the gypsy moth and keeps their numbers low. But we've had a couple of droughts. The trees were stressed, and the gypsy moths really did a number on a lot of trees. So some of the trees recover if it's not too bad, and some of them just don't. And that leaves openings in the forest, but it leaves a lot of dead trees behind. And this is a problem out west, where they have the bark beetles, and a lot of times it's a result of the forest management when they go in and plant a monocrop, a single species of tree. It's just like ringing the dinner bell for the beetles to come and say, look, here they all are. But it's also a function of, if it's a particular time of stress, if it's a drought period, trees can protect themselves from a lot of insects. They're not completely helpless. And given time, they can mount a defense. But in situations where, things are already stressed, then you can get an outbreak of damaging beetles. Now, this is going to leave a lot of dead trees that eventually are going to rot and open up the canopy. And of course, people are always worried if you have a lot of dead trees, you might have a forest fire. Now, you can have, there are different levels of forest fires, and you don't always have the same level in each forest that's being affected by a forest fire. So you can have a small ground fire. This is not really going to affect the canopy of the trees. Or you can have one of these raging things. We've been seeing a lot in the last few years about forest fires out west. Actually, if you look at the statistics, there really aren't more forest fires than there were before. Forest fires are a natural state in western forests. This is how it breaks up the age stands of trees. It's just hard to see a lot of the valuable timber getting lost and the wildlife. But it's amazing how quickly wildlife comes back to these areas. As a matter of fact, bedtime reading, the ecological importance of mixed severity fires, calling it Nature's Phoenix. This is a whole book of academic papers looking at the dramatic impact of forest fires on our woodlands in a positive way. They are a feature, just like hurricanes, windstorms, ice storms, and all the rest are a feature on our forest that promote age diversity in our forest. And that's a good thing from wildlife, and it's a good thing for the trees themselves. So, it's interesting. This, for so long we have heard, Smokey the Bear, don't start forest fires. But actually in the backcountry, it's a natural occurrence. The problem comes when people are living in the forests. And so, the argument of this book is if you're going to concentrate your forest fire suppression, do it around the places where people are, and maybe, people have to change the types of homes they build in these areas. But what the scientists are finding is that burnt wood, a lot of it survives the blaze. Not everything burns. It's not just one big ash pile like in our fireplaces. We always know in our fireplaces not everything burns and leaves behind some wood. And that wood that is left behind, you can see there's a lot of tall snags, a lot of dead material standing and some on the ground. The charred wood actually is very resistant to decay, and these trees will stand for a long time. There's actually a Japanese technique for charring wood and using it as siding, because the charred wood is just resistant to decay, and you can have a lovely black house with this charred wood on the outside. But these trees are incredibly important for the return of the wildlife. There are actually beetles and birds, woodpeckers, that will smell the forest fire and come immediately to the area of the old charred remains. And they will set up shop. The woodpeckers are really the general contractors for making new homes in these old dead trees for the birds that will follow. After a forest fire, there is a lot of regrowth. A lot of grasses, a lot of shrubs will resprout. Some of the trees, if they're in a fire regime forest, they will actually resprout, and pretty quickly the forest starts to recover, and life is back. And there are 60% of species that nest in burned forests because there is so much standing wood, dead wood, that is just perfect for wildlife. Unfortunately, a lot of times we go and harvest it. And the studies show that when we harvest these old dead areas, because there's still a lot of valuable woods underneath that charred, when this happens, the forests do not recover nearly as well, nearly as quickly, and a lot of things just don't return to the forest. So there's a lot of academics looking at the recovery of forest after a forest fire and trying to convince the public that it's not as dire as we think, that we're learning so much about the recovery of these forests that we really need to think about that dead wood as a valuable resource for the restart of the forest. And of course, around here, beavers are a great way to reset the forest, especially around our wetlands. They will take down trees, but they will also flood. When they build their beaver dam, they will flood certain trees. The trees will die because their roots, they can't get any oxygen, and those trees are left behind for wildlife. And one of the creatures that will follow beavers, here's another one, sapsuckers will drill holes, and gypsy moths, porcupine, all these creatures will sort of take out individual trees. Oh, I left out one of the slides. The creature that will follow the beavers are the great blue herons. They will actually nest in the trees that the beavers flooded. They prefer those areas because the trees that are in the middle of the flooded pond will actually be a little moat that any of the predators have to swim across and then climb up the tree while the great blue heron is protecting its nest. So great blue herons will follow the beavers and use those old dead trees that are left behind. But other animals will come and lead to the death of trees. And this is a technique. If you want to kill a tree in your yard, you can do this. You can girdle the tree. You can take off the living layer of the tree that's right under the bark. This is called girdling. And this is what in a lot of the Connecticut forests, they will leave up some of the old dead trees that are there. But if they want to make more dead trees after they've removed the harvestable material, they will girdle a tree. However, it's not as effective for wildlife, girdling a tree, as letting a tree die on its own. One of the things that will really speed up the death of a tree is the bark-boring beetles. And I love the picture. It almost looks like a little butterfly over there. The mother beetle will come and lay her eggs under the bark, and then the little larva will go out in different directions. And you can see that the tunnels are getting bigger and bigger away from the central area as the little larva is eating the cambium, eating the inner bark of the tree. And then when they get old enough, they'll chew their way out. But when the bark beetles come, are coming into the tree, they also bring fungus with them. The beetles have fungus on them. That gets into the tree, and it's the fungus that helps make a tree really valuable as a cavity. So here you can see the lovely little larva, and wherever you have these larvae, you have woodpeckers. When the woodpeckers come to get these guys, they are going to make the homes. But first you have to understand sort of the idea of where there are different parts of a tree. So right underneath the bark is the sapwood. And sapwood is really the living part of the tree. And trees can protect themselves a lot from insects. If you've ever seen sap coming out of a tree, like sticky sap from a pine tree, that is the way of trying to get those little tiny bark-boring beetles and smothering them in that sticky stuff. The bark-boring beetles are clever. They attack a tree en masse, and the sap pressure drops, and so they can't defend themselves. But it's really only the weakened and the sick, and if there's a drought or a disease or something that's affecting the tree, those are the ones the bark-boring beetles go to. The heartwood is the part of the tree that used to be alive, but a lot of chemicals are stored in there. It's not the growing part of the tree. So whether how a tree dies makes a big difference on the value to wildlife. For instance, if the tree is live and it gets attacked by the beetles and it gets into the heartwood, the fungus gets into the heartwood, then you're going to have decay in the heartwood in the central part of the tree. If the tree falls down before it's attacked by beetles or anything like that, it's going to be the sapwood that rots first. So if you want a hollow tree for wildlife, it has to be a live tree that's damaged and the inside of the tree rots away. But let's go a little further here. The fungus that you see on trees is only the fruiting body of the fungi. It's the part we see, but really on the inside are all the fungus doing the work, eating up the old dead wood. And fungi are really good because they're one of the few things that can eat wood. And if it weren't for them, we'd have a lot of problems out in our woods. So they're an important part of that recycling that needs to take place in the food chain. And that's another part of the food chain that we really don't like to talk about. But it's really, really important, and we're really getting the idea. There are all sorts of talks now about the fungi and how it helps trees communicate. But the fungi, the heartwood fungi, is what makes those hollows in the tree. It'll make for a hollow log. And sometimes you can't tell whether the tree has that rot in it. You don't necessarily want one next to your house, but they're rather strong. The outside of the tree, there's the living part. There's certain, if you have a little tiny hole in your tree, it's not going to be a problem. The tree's not going to fall down. You can have an arborist if it's near your house, check it out. But one hole doesn't mean the tree's dead, and one hole doesn't mean that it's going to fall down in your house. But these are incredibly important habitats for animals. But if the tree falls down while it's still alive, it's the sapwood that's going to rot. And there are different fungi that attack the sapwood. Once the tree is dead, the sapwood can't protect itself. So it's going to be rotted first. And the inner heartwood has those chemicals in it that the tree put there as a waste product, and that will protect the inner part of the tree. So they have different decay cycles. So how long will it take for wood to rot? It depends on what's rotting. So if the tree is on the ground, it can take from 15 to 20 years to rot. That's a long period of time for that resource to sit on the ground. But it has to be in contact with moist soil. Dry soil is just not going to do it. If it's hanging above the ground, it might be there for a long, long time. And the reason that you need that moisture is because the moisture is needed for the fungi. The fungi is going to help it rot. There are very few things that will help it rot. And if it's an oak stump, you can see the fungi growing on it and the moss and all. And sometimes, interestingly enough, those old stumps are actually supported through their root system by other trees. And sometimes the old roots will still grow, the old stumps. But here you can see this is effectively rotting. It has all sorts of little mushrooms on it, little fungi on it. It's in contact with the ground, and it's well on its way. And again, here are some more scenes of those little mushrooms taking care of this rotting log. And you can see the mosses on it. You can see old lichens on it. And here's that thing about the heartwood. When the heartwood, you can see up in the branch, up at the top, there's a branch missing and the exposed heartwood. And that's where the fungus is able to get in and rot it. But you can see there's green on either side of the blue is the sapwood. And either side of that opening for that branch, you can see that there is some green. And the sapwood will protect itself from the fungi. So it'll essentially create a barrier to keep the fungi from going into the sapwood. So the trees, if it's alive, can fight back. And then it's the center part, the heartwood, that will decay. And that decay is incredibly important. The old rotting wood is incredibly important for the soil. It is essentially adding compost to that forest soil. So you can see here is a well-rotted log. This is up at McLean's. You can see all of there's coarse woody material, but there's also a lot of broken down wood. And that is in the final stages of its decay. But there are two kinds of decay that go on a log, and you can look at this next time you go out into the woods. There's something called brown rot, which is sort of a little chunky and angular. And then there's white rot. This is the one that feels kind of spongy and is kind of fibrous. Well, they're doing two different things. The brown rot is made by a fungus that eats cellulose, and it leaves the lignin, leaves the brown lignin behind. The white rot eats the lignin and leaves the cellulose behind. But they have different functions in the forest soil. The brown material with the lignin, without the cellulose, adds to the soil organic matter. The other one, with the cellulose but without the lignin, it holds water like a sponge. So one is acting like a lovely water absorber and the other one's acting as an organic nutrient for the soil. And in those combinations of the brown rot and the white rot, you get wonderful habitats for plants. It's a lovely little compost nursery area. And this is down at the bottom is a stump. And growing out of that are several things. This is where if a seed lands there, it's a wonderful spot for germination. You can also have a nurse log. Because this tree fell down while it was still alive, it's not hollow on the inside, the tree no longer is able to protect its sapwood, so it's rotting from the outside in. And you can see that the moisture conditions in that rotting wood is able to hold those little seedlings. And here, I love this. Out west, you can see this a lot. When a tree falls down and the seedlings get onto the rotting surface, but you can almost see where that tree was. All the seeds are lined up, and you can see that they've germinated along that thing. And those logs that are rotting on the ground, holding back the water, adding organic matter, they're also good, especially if they're on a hill. They're going to stop the water going down the hill. They're going to slow down the erosion. They're going to hold everything in place. So they're incredibly important on slopes. So essentially what I'm saying is we really, really need these old dead trees on the ground. We also need the root balls when a tree falls down and its roots are exposed. That's fresh soil. And there are several trees, especially for early succession in woods, things like birch, they like to grow in mineral soil, not in the organic leaf and rich soils of the thing. But it's not just for plants in the soil that's important, it's for the wildlife. And 2/3 of all wildlife species use dead trees or wood that's down on the ground for at least some portion of their life cycle. And I love, this fellow just died, E.O. Wilson, and I love his quote. And he says, "The little things that compose the foundation of our ecosystems, the little things that run the world." Well, one of the little things that run the world in our woods are these guys. Termites, ants, sow bugs, beetles, larvae, all those different, beetle larvae, all those different little creatures. And there's a whole forest food web. We don't really talk enough about what's going on beneath our feet, but there's an incredible food web that's going on underneath. Just incredibly complicated. Bug eat bug, fungi eat fungi, bug, world. So these are just some of the little creatures that are in there. Very few of them can really eat wood, though. There's some things like termites, they have the right bacteria in their gut to be able to eat wood. But a lot of things will use the wood. But one of the things that's really important in a forest are the ants. And what they will do is if there's a tree that has some heart rot, they will go in and excavate that wood. And make a home, for them. They don't really eat the wood. So we think of carpenter ants and all the rest, but they're not really eating the woods. They're just clearing it out, making bigger cavities in the wood. And you can see here's a log. This is a picture taken up at McLean. And you can see sawdust everywhere. There wouldn't be sawdust if they were eating it. They're clearing that wood out. So they'll chew up the wood, but they don't really eat it. They eat other things. But where you have ants, you have really good control of some of the caterpillars that eat the trees. And the caterpillars will go and attack the ants will go and attack the caterpillars because they don't want the tree to be weakened. They want to protect the tree to get sugars and things. So they're not eating the wood. They're eating things up on the leaves and the flowers. So wherever there are ants, wherever there's dead wood for the ants to find a home, the scientists are finding that the ants are also protecting the trees from the gypsy moth caterpillars. So if we're too clean on the bottom, it means that we have a higher chance of having the gypsy moths attacking the trees. And not all of our ants make these kinds of homes here, but this is an anthill, and anthills are really incredibly rich compost piles because it's got all the old ant waste, it's got the decomposed plant material, and it's just, if a seed falls there, it's off to the races because it's got such a good head start. We don't have many of these ants, but we do have a few that make that. So here's what you call indirect mutualism. One thing helps the other. So the trees provide shelter for the ants. The ants, that got messed up there, the herbivorous insects, and the ant waste nourish the trees. So win, win, win. And this is what nature does. It tends to, pair things together that makes it better for everyone. And one of the things we don't really appreciate about the ants is they also end up planting a lot of our wildflowers. This is a seed. In the bottom picture, there's a seed, and you can see that funny little sort of like toupee on top of that seed. That's actually a little bribe that the plant makes. It's called an elaiosome. It's a little food package that has nothing to do with the seed, and the ants will take that seed, take it back to their nest, take it underground, and then they'll rip off the elaiosome, which is very high in lipids and good stuff for the baby ant, for larvae. They'll feed it to their young, and then they'll throw out the seed, essentially planting it. So the ants are a really important part of our woodlands. And they're also an incredibly important source of food for the birds, birds, but also larger things like bears. And the dead wood is really an important home for things like the solitary and colonial bees. And we all know that we need those native pollinators. So here you have a carpenter bee. Again, they don't eat the wood. They're just making tunnels out of the wood to raise their young. A little annoying if it gets into your house, though. And then, when you turn over a log, we should be able to see all sorts of things. This is the grocery store. There are all sorts of creatures on there that provide food for a host of other animals. And so when we remove those trees, we're removing the things that shelter the animals, but also reduce the organic material that ends up feeding some of these animals. So we really need to think about the small creatures, the impact of removing that dead wood on the small creatures. And one of the creatures that we really should be paying attention to are the amphibians. They are sort of like the canaries in the coal mines, and they are things that hopefully you will find under the logs. Unfortunately, because we've got so many invasive worms, they tend to eat up all the stuff, and we're not finding as many of these in the nature center woods. But salamanders should be the most abundant vertebrate in our forest ecosystems, more so than if you added up all the deer and everything else. You should have more biomass of salamanders, and unfortunately I don't think that's happening in our ecosystems right now. But those salamanders are also food for some of the larger animals. So the salamanders eat the little detritivores, the little creatures that eat the dead wood, eat the dead things the organic matter, and then that goes on to become food for these guys. And in turn, they also eat some of the, this is what they're doing. They're eating the sow bugs and all the rest. So, this whole lovely food chain that's going on underneath our feet. So we've got a lot of creatures that depend on this woody debris, this coarse woody debris, well, material. And it's not only the shelter, and also it's the moisture. Those salamanders need moisture. They're amphibians. They dry out really quickly. So they help keep the soil, the forest soil moist, and that's very important. So let's get back to those big old dead trees. What about the bigger animals? Those dead trees we saw earlier that stand out, those are perfect roosting places, not roosting, but perches for the creatures like hawks and owls and eagles, so that they can hunt. They're going to stay up there, and when they see something moving down on that forest floor, they're going to scoop down. Oh, here's the slide. This is the one with the great blue heron, and you can see down at the bottom the beaver lodge. And I dare say that those sticks that are up in the great blue heron's nest are also there because those were leftovers from the beavers. So those old dead trees provide an incredible thing. And if you see a log or a tree with holes in it, I want you to think of it as an apartment building with a supermarket underneath, because that's what they are. There is food and housing in the same place. So, and here are again the general contractors are the woodpeckers. They will come in. They will make a hole in the tree to raise their young. Well, first they'll do it to get food, but they will also make nesting cavities. They only use those nesting cavities once. They don't have to use it again because they can make a new one. So they're always in a new home. And we have a variety of wonderful woodpeckers. And most of them will nest in old dead trees. There's only one or two that will do it in the new trees. But 45% of our native bird species rely on snags. So if we don't have many snags in the woods, we are going to strongly impact our bird species. And you can see there are a whole host of creatures that will use these nesting cavities in the trees. They're incredibly important. The larger the hole, the larger the bird. So here we have some black vultures and turkey vultures. They will nest in these larger trees that have cavities in them. Again, you need the heart rot. You need this tree to be alive and damaged to get the heart rot in, so you get these nesting cavities. And even a cavity down on the ground, wood ducks, all sorts of, ducks and other animals, a lot of animals will use these hollow trees in the woods. And this was a picture that Laura Schuyler and the Simsbury Land Trust took. This was right at the end of her driveway up on West Ledge. Bears will hibernate for the winter in these old dead trees. So now this is not going to happen unless you have big old dead trees. You can't now, a chickadee can have a nice little nesting cavity in a small dead tree, but you need big dead trees for some of our larger creatures. So here are the smaller ones. These old hollow logs on the ground are also incredibly important habitat for wildlife. And why do we need all those creatures? Because the birds are the ones that are going to take care of the insect populations in the trees. 97% of our songbirds eat insects at some point in their life. And if you've ever wondered, if anyone's ever told you you eat like a bird, it's no compliment. Birds eat a lot, and they eat a lot of insects. One nest of baby chickadees will take between 5,000 and 9,000 caterpillars to raise one nest of baby chickadees. So you can imagine if you have lots of nesting cavities, you can have lots of nesting birds, and you will have fewer insect outbreaks in the forest. And when you do have these, the insects are doing a valuable role taking care of the old dead debris on the ground here, the bark-boring beetles. You can see there's a spider in the one in the bottom corner that's feeding on one of the larvae. So it feeds on, some of the other creatures. But then as the tree decays and has all this larva, this high protein food in it, the woodpeckers, but the bears and the skunks and the raccoons will come to these old dead trees to get food. So it feeds all the way up through the wood chain. And you can see by feeding and opening up these logs, it opens them up to more rot, and then that then becomes incorporated in the soil. And don't worry, if you see this in your yard, that tree was dying. The pileated woodpeckers will not attack a tree that's live. They are there because there are insects already in that tree. So they've done you a favor. They've notified you that that tree has problems in your yard. And then under these logs, you've got, animals just living there because there's food under there. They're going to come there. And the mushrooms that are feeding on these old dead trees become food for a whole host of animals like insects, turtles, birds, mice, squirrels. All these creatures know which mushrooms to eat. They also are home, a lot of the dead branches that are on the ground and on the are covered with lichen. And that particular lichen is going to be used by hummingbirds to make their nest. They'll stick it together with spider web to make wonderful little stretchy nests. And then the older trees, the older the tree is, the more diverse the lichen that are on these trees. So there's a whole biodiversity on these old dead trees. And it wasn't that long ago that the river groups, I think we're having these lovely quilts about the farming in the river, wasn't that long ago that it was common practice to remove dead trees from the streams. And certainly as I can see that the person doing canoeing probably doesn't enjoy having to portage over that old dead tree. And it is a concern when you get, the old dead trees washing downstream, it gets caught up on our bridges and things like that. But actually, more and more the scientists are realizing we've got to get dead trees into the woods. It's a very important part of the stream ecology. It slows down the water, it traps sediment, and it provides shelter for an awful lot of wildlife. And there's some people who say they don't, the more wood you have in the stream, the more fish you will have. So, for so many years we've straightened our streams, we've cleared them out, we've made it so the flood water can go down quickly, but actually it's detrimental to some of the health of the stream. In Finland, where they've had a lot of logging in their woodlands, that's their main product, is timber. They're actually looking to rewild some of their areas, and one of the things they're doing is intentionally putting wood into the streams, and they are rewilding their landscape. And they recognize that the way we have been managing our landscape has not been particularly beneficial to our wildlife. This is a picture that's at Concoponcet. It's a Connecticut state forest. Our state forests are there in part for logging, for forest products. But you can see that there's something missing in the picture of this managed forest. There is an anomaly here. There's a log there, but I walked this area a few months ago, and I was surprised by how little wood was on the managed portion of the property. And that was of concern to me, because without the logs on the ground, you don't have those salamanders, you don't have, the abundant wildlife. There were very few snags, there were very few things, because nothing was really old enough. It had been recently cut. This is another area that we toured, and you can see there are branches on the ground, but pretty much bare mineral soil and then some branches, and you can see the number of trees that have been left behind. The idea behind this cut was to allow oak saplings to grow, and there was a large deer population. There was no deer hunting, but they had taken all the trees, and the tops of the trees, they had circled the entire site to prevent the deer from coming in. And it will grow back. Here's, the berry bushes will come back, but there are just not that many trees. And when I did ask, will these older trees be left to continue to grow? More of what I heard was that a lot of them will be cut down on the next cycle when the young trees have come up. It was of concern to me, because if we don't have the old trees, how are we going to have the habitat like this? Which trees will be left to become these wonderful old giants? This is a remarkable habitat tree. How are we going to get them if we don't let them grow? So we've lost a lot of our, it's not virgin, it was managed by Native Americans. But we did used to have, if you read, there's a lovely book by David McCullough about the pioneers. I think it's all about the people that moved from here over to the southern Ohio. And the descriptions of the wonderful old, you got it, about the wonderful old trees that were there, these magnificent old trees. Well, we don't have them anymore. We've got, a few. We had cathedral pines in Cornwall. They were, and less than 1% of Massachusetts forests have old growth habitat. And old growth doesn't mean all the trees are old. It usually means that there's a mixture of age groups, but there are some old trees. We have to let them grow. And I see Susan Messina's in the back. Susan was instrumental in getting Belden Forest, which is just behind here, over there, I think, to be left to be an old growth forest. The trees are already 120, 140 years old plus. They're magnificent. If you haven't seen them, it's an easy walk once you find the entrance and climb up the hill. It's a lovely walk. It's just a little pocket forest, but these are beautiful old trees. If we don't let them grow old, we won't have these magnificent old things. But the interesting thing is, it could be blown down tomorrow. We have a big windstorm. They could all be blown, and that would reset the forest clock. But that's part of the natural process. There's the old growth forest. Simsbury is part of that. But you can see there're just not that many yet. There are not that many areas we're letting grow old and letting see what happens. Let the forest organize itself. So, getting back to that question, which is the most valuable to the forest? The living trees have their value. They do wonderful things in the forest, but the old trees really have an important role in the forest. I love the fact that this old tree has been labeled. It says, this tree is safe to provide food and shelter for wildlife. Yes, we need to appreciate that these things happen. After all, these are these wonderful heritage trees. I love this. I took this picture. It's in McLean Game Refuge. And this quote, "The real jewel of my disease-ridden woodlot is the pronothary warbler. The flash of his blue and gold plumage amid the dank decay of the June woods is in itself proof that dead trees are transmuted into living animals and vice versa." That's that whole cycle that we were talking about. And also, why should we think about this? Well, we are Connecticut after all. And if it wasn't for the charter oak, which had heart rot, there would be no place to hide the charter, and who knows what would have happened then. So there's all sorts of reasons to celebrate the old trees in the forest and to really demand that we have areas where these trees are allowed to live out their full and useful life, including when they turn into compost and become the sites, the rich sites for the future trees. So I hope this has given you a different insight into what you see on the forest floor. Remember, look down, not up. All right. So thank you very much. And does anyone have any questions? All right then. Oh yes. All right. So we have to have a microphone. SCTV has very kindly taped this for us.
Thank you. I have a soft voice. This is really a comment more than a question, although I'm starting to understand what's happening. I live in Windsor, in an area where most people's backyards back up on a fair amount of what's now becoming older growth. Yeah. And in the 80s, when the hurricane and the windstorms took the trees down, the tree companies came in, and in the backyard, they would take the tree down and take everything away. And now, in the 2020s, with the windstorms we've had in the last couple of years, and those trees are coming down, they come in, and what they're doing is they finish taking the tree down, but they leave it there.
Lovely.
And so I'm thinking, well, this is what's going on.
I hope so. I know in some areas, when they've had damage, I think it's sleeping forest, was a sleeping giant forest. There was a lot of wind damage, and I think they cleared a lot of the trees out. But when they leave them behind, it's expensive. Who was I talking to? It's expensive to bring down a tree. It's a lot of work. It's dangerous work. But if you can leave them down, I know I've had some limbs come down on my trees in my yard, and I'm starting to incorporate those limbs into the garden. And that's something I think we should, it's an opportunity to create little habitats in your own yard. But if they can leave it on the ground, It's also better for the regeneration of oak trees, because if you have, like some of those slides I showed, that all the sort of like the pickup sticks of logs, the deer can't get in there to browse the young seedlings, so they can get to be a certain height. When you clear it all out, it's just like, here we are. So, but of course, we do need timber products, but we also need old trees. So it has to be that balancing act. And, on some of our properties, I think we can leave them and see what happens. Yeah. Any other? Susan.
Hey, Margery, thank you so much. I've been dying to see your Morticulture talk, so this is great. I wanted to mention your hotel supermarket comment and add to it a pharmacy issue. And when you mentioned in the beginning that we don't have any economic value for these old things and things like that, I mean, there's so much we're still discovering about the molecules and mechanisms and interconnections and potential of all these natural substances and their interactions. So I think that first of all, I mean, there's a value to this that's well beyond economics, but there is an economic value we just haven't quantified yet.
Yeah.
The second point that I wanted to make, besides the pharmacy issue, is in terms of the old growth forest network. So I'm the Hartford County coordinator,
Yes.
and I'm really working right now on at least one and likely two forests in Hartford. So there is an actual old growth forest in Hartford, pre-Revolutionary War,
Wow.
next to the North Branch of the Park River. And I've been quietly trying to look into it for a few years, bringing experts there. It's small, but some of the trees are over 300 years old.
That's fantastic.
It's phenomenal, and it's not easy to get to, and few people know about it. But one of the tragedies is there was recently, a project with heavy equipment going on in there. Guess what? Removing the logs out of the river under the idea that they were causing flooding, which was absolutely not the case. It's just, there's just not enough ecologists on the land making decisions about what's going on. It's become kind of an engineering checklist kind of thing, and not a holistic approach to these critical special places that we have. So thank you for highlighting.
Thank you. I was figuring that the pharmacy was in the grocery store like they have here. But you're absolutely right. And also the fungi, there are chemicals in the fungi. I mean, there's just so much we're learning about the fungi and the communication between the trees. There's so much going on in the woods that we have just started to understand. And when you consider, forestry as a discipline is only 100 years old, and trees live for a lot longer than that. There's just so much, it's hard to do experiments on the forest in our lifetime because you can't see the results. So, we all have to have a certain amount of, be a little, aware that we don't know what we don't know, and be open to the idea that there's more going on. After all, nature's been working on this for millions of years and has worked out a lot of the kinks. So, I need a bumper sticker, what would nature do? And I think there's an awful lot that we could learn from just following their lead. And it's amazing. The more I research this topic, the more I see, oh yeah, this has all been worked out. They've got this. So, but there's a great reluctance to let forests organize themselves for some reason. Yeah, Susan.
Sorry, I have one more comment, because you mentioned the forest floor, and I just heard this. I heard there's a paper recently, and there was just an episode on Radio Lab called Forests on Forests, talking about all the carbon and biodiversity that's in the canopy of these big trees, like a lot of little, ecosystems in the nooks and crannies of the big trees, and soil and microbes and mushrooms and bugs, plants, and even other trees growing in the canopies of trees.
Yeah.
And the mineral composition of that soil is different than on the ground. And they think that the trees are able to pull in what they need from the canopy as like little snack boxes when they need it. So I don't know. I just thought that was just totally mind blowing and amazing.
There's just so much going on. There's just so much to read. I mean, there's so I highly recommend the book about the forest, the nature, nature's phoenix, and really just understanding that change is a part of forests. That they're never going to be the same. So if something happens, it's okay. It'll take care of itself.
We have an oak in our front lawn, and it's 140 years old.
Lovely.
But there are pine trees in our backyard who are younger and are already rotting.
It can happen. I mean, a young oak tree can rot. I mean, sometimes they're growing in the wrong place. Something can be interfering with its roots. It can be, bad luck. I mean, that's just the thing. When you look into the woods and you try to think which tree is going to be the one that's going to live to an old age, I don't know. It depends on the genetics of the tree. There's just so many complicated factors. But do you know what kind of oak tree it is? Are the leaves wiggly like this, or are they pointy? Oh, all right. You've got a white oak tree. Okay. Yeah, and they're really good. The squirrels love them.
Yeah.
And so the wildlife.
Yeah, we have a
the
lot
other
of
ones, the red oaks and the black oaks, their acorns don't taste as good. They're bitter, much more bitter.
You gathered the acorns for the squirrels?
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very, very much for coming out here and sharing my enthusiasm for dead trees.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.